Hey there, all you cool cats and kittens. It's Miss Sloma from John M. Stumbo, and today we are beginning Unit 1 over narrative writing. Lesson 1 will be about plot. By the end of today's lesson, you will be able to define and identify the 5 main elements that make up the plot. We're going to begin by taking notes over plot. Then we're going to do some practice. We're going to read a story and then identify the parts of the plot within that story. We're going to then do a quick review of what we learned today, and then you will finish up with a knowledge check that you will be able to find on Google Classroom. Okay, before we can begin taking notes, we have to make sure that our page is set up properly. We're going to want our name on the left, the date and the page number on the right, and then our title right in the middle, and don't forget to underline. Go ahead and pause this video and get your page set up, and unpause it when you're ready to begin taking notes. Alright, now that you're ready, let's begin by reviewing our I can statement one more time. I can define and analyze the 5 main elements of plot. Alright, before we can talk about the elements of plot, let's give a definition to the word plot itself. So plot is the sequence of events that make up a story. And there are 5 different parts of the plot that we're going to learn about today. The first element of the plot that we're going to learn about is the exposition. This is the beginning of the story, where the characters, the setting, and the main conflict is introduced. That is followed by the rising action. This is where the main conflict is developed, and the events leading to the climax unfold. Next, we have the climax. This is the turning point of the story. Some people would call it the most interesting part or the most exciting part of the story. This is like the peak of the mountain. We have reached the top. After the climax, we have the falling action. This is where the story begins to slow down and the characters work to solve the conflict. And finally, after the falling action, we have our resolution. This is the end of the story, and this is where any remaining issues are resolved. And this is a nice visual just to help you see each part of the plot laid out in the order that they belong in. We always start with the exposition, we move on to the rising action, we reach the climax, which is the peak of the mountain, then we have our falling action, and finally the resolution or the end of the story. Okay, it's really vital that you make sure you take down these notes and you have everything written down before you move on. So if you need to, please go ahead and pause the video right now so that you can finish your notes, and unpause when you're ready to move on. Okay, so we defined the 5 main elements that make up the plot, and we took notes over that. So now we're going to go ahead and move into our practice session, where we are going to identify the main elements that make up plot within a story. Okay, so I'm going to play an audio recording of the story The Buckwheat by Hans Christian Andersen. And as we are listening to this story, I am going to be highlighting on my screen every time I come across something that I think might be a part of the setting, anytime I come across a new character, whenever I see that a conflict has arisen. I will also be looking for the turning point in the story as well as the conclusion. So I will be annotating for those things on my screen, which are the key elements of the plot. And if you do not feel like following along with this video and you would rather read the story silently in your head, you can annotate for these things on your own. I will have a copy of the story on Google Classroom, so you can just go ahead and pause the video here, read the story on your own, and then come back as we review the story later on. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and play the audio recording of this story, and I'll annotate it for the setting, characters, conflict, turning point, and conclusion as we follow along.
The Buckwheat by Hans Christian Andersen. Very often, after a violent thunderstorm, a field of buckwheat appears blackened and singed, as if a flame of fire had passed over it. The country people say that this appearance is caused by lightning, But I will tell you what the sparrow says, and the sparrow heard it from an old willow tree, which grew near a field of buckwheat, and is there still. It is a large venerable tree, though a little crippled by age. The trunk has been split, and out of the crevice grass and brambles grow. The tree bends forward slightly, and the branches hang quite down to the ground, just like green hair. Corn grows in the surrounding fields, not only rye and barley, but oats, pretty oats that, when ripe, look like a number of little golden canary birds sitting on a bough. The corn has a smiling look, and the heaviest and richest ears bend their heads low, as if in pious humility. Once there was also a field of buckwheat, and this field was exactly opposite to Old Willow Tree. The buckwheat did not bend like the other grain, but erected its head proudly and stiffly on the stem. "I am as valuable as any other corn," said he, "and I am much handsomer. My flowers are as beautiful as the bloom of the apple blossom, and it is a pleasure to look at us. Do you know of anything prettier than we are, you old willow tree?" And the willow tree nodded his head, as if he would say, "Indeed I do." But the buckwheat spread itself out with pride and said, "Stupid tree, he is so old that grass grows out of his body." There arose a very terrible storm. All the field flowers folded their leaves together, or bowed their little heads, while the storm passed over them, but the buckwheat stood erect in its pride. "Bend your head as we do," said the flowers. "I have no occasion to do so," replied the buckwheat. "Bend your head as we do," cried the ears of corn. "The angel of the storm is coming. His wings spread from the sky above to the earth beneath. He will strike you down before you can cry for mercy." "But I will not bend my head," said the buckwheat. "Close your flowers and bend your leaves," said the old willow tree. "Do not look at the lightning when the cloud bursts. Even men cannot do that. In a flash of lightning heaven opens, and we can look in, but the sight will strike even human beings blind. What then must happen to us, who only grow out of the earth, and are so inferior to them, if we venture to do so?" "Inferior indeed," said the buckwheat. "Now I intend to have a peep into heaven." Proudly and boldly he looked up, while the lightning flashed across the sky, as if the whole world were in flames. When the dreadful storm had passed, the flowers and the corn raised their drooping heads in the pure, still air, refreshed by the rain, but the buckwheat lay like a weed in the field, burnt to blackness by the lightning. The branches of the old willow tree rustled in the wind, and large water drops fell from his green leaves as if the old willow were weeping. Then the sparrows asked why he was weeping, when all around him seemed so cheerful. "See," they said, "how the sun shines and the clouds float in the blue sky. Do you not smell the sweet perfume from flower and bush? Wherefore do you weep, old willow tree?" Then the willow told them of the haughty pride of the buckwheat and of the punishment which followed in consequence. This is the story told me by the sparrows one evening when I begged them to relate some tale to me.
Okay, so that is the story of the buckwheat. Okay, so we've read the story, The Buckwheat, and we have made some annotations while reading it. So the last thing that we're going to do with the story is just do a quick plot analysis. So let's start with the exposition. At the beginning of the story, we learn about the characters that are the sparrow, the buckwheat, the willow tree, and the different types of corn. They're all in a field, and we don't really know what time period this is, but we learn that the main conflict of the story is that the buckwheat is prideful and doesn't really listen. So the rising action is when the storm is coming, and everyone in the field is warning the buckwheat to not look at the lightning and to bow its head. And then we reach the climax of the story where the lightning strikes, and then the buckwheat is obviously harmed by this because he didn't listen to everyone else. So in the falling action, the storm kind of passes and everyone comes out and it's nice and sunny and beautiful, but the willow tree is really sad. And we find out why the willow tree is sad. It's because the buckwheat perishes, and the willow tree is just kind of upset that the buckwheat let pride get in the way of, saving its own life. And so that's the story of the buckwheat, and that is how you can take a story and kind of analyze its plot using our little plot mountain. Okay, before we wrap up today's lesson, let's do a quick review of what we have learned today. So the plot is the sequence of events that make up a story, and the elements of plot are the exposition, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and the resolution. And we can use this little mountain as a reminder for how to keep track of the order of these elements. So hopefully you can, at this point, define and identify the 5 main elements that make up plot. We took our notes, we practiced with a story, we did a quick review. Now you can go on to Google Classroom and complete your knowledge check for my class, and you're good to go.